do I got a video for you guys today? So last time I built an EJ25, a lot of you guys were asking me how to do it, a detailed walkthrough. So we're gonna be doing that in these next two videos. So this video today is gonna be covering measuring the block, making sure all of your tolerances in spec. Now I'm gonna say this now, I don't use plastic gauge. My precision measuring tools are gonna be far more accurate than sticking a piece of plastic between a bearing and the crank and squishing it down and measuring it that way. It's a good check if you wanna do that, but it's 2022. It's 2022. We're gonna use some precision measuring tools because that's what I do. So before we start and just jump into measuring the block, let's first cover what tools you're gonna need. So let's start going through the tools that we have on the table here. Some of these outside of the case may look familiar to you. So we have a standard 3/4 inch torque wrench. This is gonna be used to torque the case halves together, the rod bolts and everything like that. Now with rod bolt torquing, we're not gonna be relying off of torque. I don't like going off of torque for rod bolts. Personally, I like to I go off of rod bolt stretch. So if you have a stretch gauge, definitely suggest using it. If you don't have one, I'll link all these tools down below in the description for you guys as well, so that way if you want to build your own engines, you can definitely snag all of these. Keep in mind that precision measuring tools are calibrated tools, typically calibrated a year out from the day that they're manufactured. Some calibration dates will vary as well. There are some specialty places where you can send your tools to go get recalibrated if you would like to do so. So I've purchased all of these within the last year, so I know that all of these are still within cal date. They should come with some type of documentation stating when they were calibrated, the temperature they were calibrated, everything like that, because calibration is going to vary on temperature too. But for rod bolt stretch, typically I like to use a stretch gauge on here. So this will measure the actual rod bolt stretch of the rod. It's not torque tightened down right now, so it's not really gonna do anything. But as you can see, when I push the dial in, it changes the measurement right there. So a stretch gauge is going to be nice. We are not going to be using this today because we're not torquing the rods down to the crank quite yet. We're only going to be pulling the measurements to make sure that everything is still in spec. But it's a good one to mention now, so that way if you guys watch the next video, you know what you're looking at. Next up, we have a set of micrometers. So a lot of people call these outside micrometers, and for some reason it bothers me. I don't know why. Technically they are called that, but for me they've always just been micrometers. These are, I guess, technically also micrometers, but to me these are calipers. Calipers, which should be off. Calipers, micrometers. These are gonna measure like a diameter of something if you wanna measure it that way. Typically, true micrometers are going to be a lot more accurate than using a set of calipers like this. So micrometers will come in very different ranges. So this set is a 2 to 3 inch set. You've got other sets that'll be between 0 and 1 inch, 3 and 4 inch. It can go on and on and on. I think the biggest one I've seen is maybe a 36 to 37 inch. They can get pretty big. So the micrometers are going to be used to measure the crank mainly, just to be able to measure the diameter of it accurately, because we're going to need that measurement to be able to verify that against what we have inside of the block to make sure that our main bearings and our rod bearings are within spec. So we're gonna set this guy aside for now. This one you'll probably recognize pretty quick. This is just an inch-pound torque wrench. You may or may not need one for whatever you're doing. Regardless, they're good to have laying around the garage. The last main tool that you're gonna need is a set of dial bore gauges. So these go between 2 to 6 inches. You are going to need a set of these regardless, just to be able to verify bore of the mains, bore of the rods. If you really want to, you can measure the bore of the block as well. We are not going to be measuring the bore of the block because the block, I know, has already been machined to our piston. So the machine shop that I use is a very trusted one for Subarus. Outfront Motorsports, they are who I have do all of my machining. They've done my 6-cylinder in my STI. They've done my 4-cylinder in my old STI. They've done this one for us as well. So I buy all my pistons through Outfront because when they machine the block, they bore and hone it. They bore the actual engine to the piston size. So these are 99.75 pistons versus stock piston size being around 99.5. So now that we've kind of covered the tools, let's bust out our crankshaft. I'm gonna get it set up in the vise next to me and we can start measuring that thing. So I've got my crankshaft set up in a vise here. I've got the crank bolt on one end of it and I've just got a rag put around it to make sure that we don't damage anything. This is gonna keep the crank from moving on us at all as we pull our measurements off of this with our micrometers. Now you don't have to do this. This is just the way that I do it. Is if you look at this paper here, I've got things labeled rear, front, main rod, main rod, main rod, main rod, main. So we're gonna go through and we're gonna pull the measurements off of all of these. They should be fairly close because this is a brand new crankshaft. So Let me show you kind of what we're doing here. All right, so we've got our crankshaft right here bolted up. I've already gone through and pulled all these measurements just because there's a little bit of math involved that goes through doing this. So if you've never used a set of micrometers, they're really not too hard to use. If you look on right there, if it'll focus on it, right there on the micrometers, you'll see a whole bunch of tiny little numbers there. So all those numbers, it'll go all the way out to quite a ways. So all those numbers are tenths, hundredths, and thousandths of inches. So right here on the front we have tenths and hundredths, and then up here on the veneer side of it, if I can get it to refocus, those are the thousandths. So when you go to do this, there's a little bit of math. So let me get this on here. We'll do the rear main real quick. Actually, no, we'll just do a middle one. We'll do a random middle main right here. Of course, I have the crankshaft put in a weird spot where there's an oil galley right in the way, so we'll do this one. And make sure you're not pulling any measurements off of oil galley holes, because it'll probably throw your measurements off. So we're gonna go ahead, unwind the calipers here. We're gonna go ahead and get one side set up on there, and we're gonna start cranking it in. Don't just start yeeting and cranking this thing down. So we are not centered, and you can go back and forth to make sure that you're centered on this thing. And bring this up. I like to shoot for the middle of the journal, in the middle of the crank right there. And then once you feel a little bit of tension, you're not going to keep turning this main knob out here. You're actually going to go out on the very end, and you're going to hear these little clicks. And what that's going to do is just cinch the micrometers up, and it's not going to go past the point of where the measurement is. If you just start cinching down this main one, you're going to throw off your measurements, and it's just not going to... can I set that down? Yeah, I can. If you just start cranking down this outer one right here, you're going to be forcing your measurements to be off, which you don't want to do. So let me grab the camera. I'll show you guys this measurement here, and I'll kind of walk you through how to read it. You guys are going to have to bear with me for a moment because this is the best I can get the camera to focus on this. I'll lock the micrometers, pull them off, and show you this off of the crank also. So right now we have the crank set up on, or we got the micrometer set up on here. I had to move it down from the top bearing down here just so that way the camera could see it. So you're going to see all these lines right here. So we've got all these big hashes labeled 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are going to go all the way to 9. Now if you look in between those bigger lines, we've got one right here and one right here. We've got 0.025, 0.050, 0.075. Now you're not really going to go off of these numbers. They're going to be reference for this one, except for the big number. So we know these are 2 to 3 inch calipers. So that's going to dictate our first number being 2. So we know our first, it's going to be 2 point. Now we need to figure out the point part, which is where people get a little lost with micrometers, and I promise they're not that bad. So we are at 2.3 because we're right past the 3, 2.3, and then if you look at this, we're right past the 0.050 mark. Now because we're past the 0.050 mark, we don't know where we're at in between 0.050 and 0.075. Now to figure that out, you're going to see all of these numbers over here on the side of the micrometer thimble. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take whatever number is below or in line with that line right there. You never want to go above, you always want to go below. So for us, it's 2.3, and then we have that 0.050, so we're going to add that 0.050. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to see that we're below this line, which is 12. So it's 0.050 plus 0.012, which is going to put us at 0.062. 0.062. So we can go, we know the micrometers are 2 inches, so 2.362. And then over here on the back, you're going to see a veneer scale. So back here's the veneer scale on the back of the thimble. Now only one of these lines is going to line up. So if we look at this, we're going to use the measurements on the very inside of the thimble right there. You'll see it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., etc. Now we're going to come here, we're going to find the 2 lines that line up, which is about the 3 where I'm looking. Could be between 3 and 2, somewhere between there. So if you really want to get technical, you can split the difference if you want. We're just going to round up to the 3. So our final measurement comes out to 2.362 inches. So let me lock these real quick. I'll pull them off of this crank and I'll show you guys. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about with the micrometers again, just to show you off the crank. So we know that the micrometers are between 2 and 3 inches. We know that right there, it says so. So if we come back up here and look at this, this is where you're gonna see all your measurements. And of course, this lens just doesn't wanna focus. So right there is where all of your measurements are. Like I said, you're gonna go through there, you're gonna mix up the numbers a little. You're not gonna mix them up. You're probably like, what the hell is this guy talking about? It's very difficult to explain how to use micrometers. I'll link below a really good video also if you guys wanna watch that, but you guys can see right there. So we've got the 0, 1, 2, and 3. And then we've got our other numbers on the end, and you're always going to go with the number that is on the lower line or lined up Then we have our vernier scale on the rear. So you're gonna go ahead, you're gonna use your micrometers, you're gonna take all of these measurements. And like I said, if any of what I just said confused you, because it probably did, I'll link below another video on how to use micrometers so that way you guys can learn how to measure this stuff. They're really not that bad to use once you figure them out. So over here, I've got all of the measurements written out for our crankshaft. So with the rear main, we're at 2.3621. With our rod on cylinder 4, we're at 2.046. It might be a 6. No, that's 2.0466. Sorry, I chicken scratched that one. The next main is going to be 2.3624. The next rod down is 2.0466, and then as you can see going down the line. Surprisingly enough, all the rods were pretty consistent at 2.0466. All the mains varied a little bit, like we have 2.3623, we have 2.321, 2.421. So all the mains are pretty close to one another. So we now have all of our measurements off the crankshaft, which is a good one to have. Next up, we need to get all of the measurements off of the rods. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna come over here, we're gonna take our Manley connecting rods, we're gonna take them all out of the bags, we're gonna wipe them down with a clean rag and some brake clean. Then we're gonna come over here and grab our King bearings. We're gonna get the King bearings set inside of the rods, and I'll show you guys how to do that as well, because it might scare or confuse some people. So let's pull these guys out. Now what you don't want to do with all of these connecting rods is mix and match rods with boxes, because the weights in the boxes are accurate to what the rod is measured at. So keep that in mind. We've also got our torque specs here, and this has the rod bolt stretch like I was talking about earlier. It's going to highly vary off of what your bolt is, so keep that in mind as we go through these. And go ahead and lay all of these out, and we're going to do all of these one at a time. Daddy-o. We've got one H-Tuff series right there. And here we have all of our rod bearings. So first thing we need to do is go ahead and split the rod off. So we're gonna be, oh, look at that. It already tells us we're using ARP 2000s on here, which is nice. Now, if you can't get the rod off of here, what you can do is go ahead, stick it in a vise and just tap it lightly with a hammer. Not a hammer, but like a rubber mallet. Love tap. And that'll separate the rod cap from the actual rod. You don't have to fucking wail on it either. Don't wail on your rods. And also, don't mix and match your rod caps and your rods. They are all line honed together, so if you start mix and matching a lot of these, you're probably gonna end up spinning a bearing rather quickly. So, now that we've got this guy split apart, we can go ahead and pull these bolts right out. My hands are so freaking cold, you guys. Holy hell. Now, when you buy bearings, you are going to buy these in a specific size. All bearings are like, they have standard size, oversized, undersized, a lot of different sizes for bearings, so make sure you're paying attention when you are ordering bearings. Now you are going to notice on the rod cap and the rod itself, there is a tang here. That tang does need to line back up when these go back together. Like I said, these were line honed together, so you need to make sure that everything is spick and span when you're putting it back together. You'll also notice that on all of the all of the bearings, there is a little tang on them as well, so the tang's going to go to the tang. These are the PMAX coated ones, so they do have a slightly better coating, or they do have a coating on them, so that way they will help prevent wear a little bit better than standard bearings will. It's just my preference for what I like to use on these. So let's get this cleaned off with some brake clean and a clean rag, and then we can start measuring this guy. You don't need a ton of brake clean, you just need enough to clean the surface. You just don't want to chooch this guy down with any material under it. And you'll see the cross hatching or the machining marks in here, which they look pretty nice in these guys. And clean off both of these guys, set them back down. Before all of this gets assembled as well, keep in mind that we are going to clean all of this again. We just don't want any contamination underneath of that bearing before we tighten it down and squish them together. That would not, it wouldn't end well. If you really want to, you can, but I'm not your dad. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Now to get your bearing in, you're going to line up the tang. I'm going to push the tang down into the rod, and then while holding it, slide the other side in, and it's going to go right in like that. Now the reason we have to put these bearings in right now is because the bearings need to be measured, or the rod needs to be measured with the bearings in, so that way we know what our clearances are between the, whoop, look at that, between the crank and the rod. So now that we have tang to tang, get our bolts back in. Now we can go ahead and torque these guys down. For the clearances on this, I am going to go by bolt stretch again. So I just went back, double checked the parts that I got. So we are looking for a bolt stretch of 0.0058 to 0.0062. Now before we even go to tighten or torque any of this down, we need to go ahead and set the stretch gauge first. So On here, there's a small set screw, so I need to grab an Allen key so I can lock that. On our stretch gauge here, what we're gonna do is zero this thing out. So what we wanna do is not slide it completely out like that, but we do wanna move it in. We're gonna go ahead, so in ARP fasteners, since we are using an ARP tool, you'll see that on the actual bolt, there's a dimple right there. Same with the other side. So there's a dimple on both sides for you to be able to get the stretch gauge in. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and get the stretch gauge set up here. So we're gonna get one end in one dimple. We're gonna slide that guy in more because he keeps coming out. And this can be a little bit of a pain to set up. So now that we have the bolt in there, what we're gonna do is go ahead and just push this guy down until we get him to about the 0 right there. And we can adjust this a little bit. I'm just putting a little bit of preload on this gauge, not a lot. So we've got a little bit of preload. So now we can go through here and we can rotate this dial so that way it is at 0. So right now we have no stretch on this bolt. And then we can go ahead and come down here. And now I can't get the bolt out. Oh yeah, I can. So we're just gonna slide the bolt off. And now we can get these torqued and tightened down. Now one thing you don't wanna do is have this gauge rotate around more than once, which it doesn't. Because if you start having this thing spin around a whole bunch, that's gonna throw off all of your measurements. So let's put this guy in the vise, tighten these guys down. On their torque specs, it does say about 60 foot-pounds. We'll see where, we'll go in increments. We'll see what we end up being at for this. I like to go incrementally so that way we're not just jumping into things here. So, start torquing it down. So some people are gonna say, hey Tanner, they make a special tool to put a rod in there and whatnot. I know, I just don't have it. Okay, I'm sorry, I will buy one, I promise. Target for them, torque value should be around, we'll start off at 30 pounds and see where that puts us. There's 30. And this is gonna be the most accurate way that you're gonna be able to get this. You stick him in and then you're just gonna float this. So right now we're about 0.0045 right now, which is definitely not enough. So we go tighter, baby. And once we've determined what average bolt stretch is on these, for the other 3 rods, we're just gonna torque them down to whatever torque value we get from here because bolt stretch should be identical. When it does come down to final assembly, we are gonna double check all of these again. This is just to get our numbers to make sure that all of our tolerances are within spec. So we know 30 is not enough, so let's go more. That puts us at about 0.0060 at 40 pounds. So we'll run with 40 pounds for right now. I'm pretty happy with that. It puts us pretty much right in the middle of where we want to shoot for. I'm gonna measure this other side just to double check. You don't want to hardcore be like taking that rod strip or that rod bolt gauge and moving it around a whole bunch. You literally just want to let it float on here. That is one thing that you do have to be careful of. So we're not even at 0.005, so we do need to go tighter. Double check your measurements. Always double check your measurements because that was a really good example of, okay, we look like we're good, but we're not actually good. So that means we go tighter. Right on the money at 0.0060. That's what I'm talking about, daddy-o. So now that we've got our fasteners torqued down, we can go ahead and measure the bore of this. So I'm just gonna turn the rod sideways here. My vise is really annoying in the spot that it's in. Before we even stick a dial bore gauge in here, what we need to do is set up our micrometers to the size of what we got off of the crank. And then that'll give us a rough estimate of where we're at for in here, so that way we can validate to see what our clearance is between the crank and the actual bearings in here. So what did we get? We got pretty consistent, the same number across every single rod, which is 2.046. 2.04666. So now we can get our micrometer set up to 2.0466. Lock that guy in place. Now they do make a special holder for this if you want. Once again, I don't have it, so I'm just gonna lock these down in a vise. And what we're gonna do is use this to be able to set our dial bore gauge. So now with the dial bore gauge, you're gonna be able to spin the little dial and everything to be able to set everything to 0. So just like with the ARP gauge, we don't want the dial to spin around multiple times. So there is a setup that you need to do with here. They do have different tip sizes for what you're going to be using, and you want to try to get these as center as possible, and then rotate your dial till you're at about 0, like that. So now that we're set at 0, we know that our dial indicator is now set up to 2.0466. Now when it doesn't have any pressure on it, that's fine if it doesn't read 0 because that's not going to matter. What we want to know is what the difference is between 2.0466 is and what the actual rod is with the bearing in it. So stick this guy on our rod bearing now. So we're shooting for about 2 thousandths here of clearance between the rod and the crank. Now in theory, A rod should never actually be riding on the crankshaft. There should always be a thin film of oil here, which the bearing rides on. If you have bearing to crankshaft contact, you're gonna have a bad day because you're more than likely going to spin a bearing. So getting clearances right is ideal for this. Rod bearings are a little bit easier to do than mains because the mains you have to assemble, disassemble the block a couple times. So we're shooting for about 1.5 to 2 thou. 2 thou would be ideal. So want to make sure that you get your gauge level. If you don't, it is going to be reading all over the place. So right now I've got it perfectly level in here, and we're sitting at about right there is center to center. We're sitting right at 0.02 of an inch, which is perfect. It's exactly what we want for clearances on that one. So that's how you're going to measure your rod bearings. So let me run through and measure the rest of these rods, and then I'll show you guys how to set this up on the mains, just because I already have this set up. So let me knock out the other ones real quick, and then we'll do the mains. So now that we have our rods done, I'm just gonna set them aside over here with the bearings. Next up, we're gonna need to grab our main bearings here. So this is a set of standard main bearings. Whenever it comes to measuring bearing clearances on these cars, I always like to start out with standard, and then if I need to go plus or minus, I will order them. But I don't like ordering a whole bunch of excess of bearings all at once. So right here, we have a set of case halves from a I wanna say it was a 2018 STI that spun a bearing. I ended up with the case halves, sent these down to the machine shop. Now what the machine shop did is they bored and honed out all of the cylinders as well as detailing the block. We did not line hone the mains. A lot of people have this weird misconception with Subarus that if you split apart the case halves, they're garbage and you can never use them again. That's simply not true. That is not true. It has been proven time and time again that people use seasoned case halves. I prefer seasoned case halves because they've already gone through X amount of heat cycles. So what we need to do here is get these case halves split apart. This has just come back from Outfront Motorsports, and there are 2 bolts inside of the cooling jackets over here that are holding these together. We're gonna go ahead and pull both of those out. We're gonna clean off all of the main surfaces down here. We're gonna set our bearings inside of each one of those surfaces, and this is gonna be the same exact process that we did with our rods that we're gonna be doing with the block. So whenever you use a bore gauge and you measure with a bore gauge, you wanna make sure you're going vertically instead of horizontally. If you go horizontally, I've seen that the measurements aren't as accurate as vertically. It's a lot easier to hold something up and down than it is trying to finagle it in and out. So let's get this thing split apart. Let's go ahead and get our bearings in there. We're gonna get it torqued down. Now, I don't care if you've done an engine X amount of times, it helps 100% to have these printouts handy. It's going to be different for every single engine that you do out there. With Subarus, you have to split the case halves, and there is a torque sequence and torque settings to retorque the case halves. You want to torque the case halves down when doing these measurements to give you the most accurate representation for what you're going to see in numbers in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and time lapse through this part of me splitting this case half open. We're going to take those bolts out. I'm going to tap on it right here with that rubber mallet, get these split apart, cleaned up, get everything torqued down, and then we're going to start going through here and measuring everything. I do think it's important to show you guys this. Depending on what engine you're working on, your bearings may be different sizes going through the mains. So on the rear, Subarus don't technically have thrust bearings, but on the rear is kind of where your thrust bearing would be. It's got a built-in thrust bearing into the actual main bearing right there. So those can only go in one spot. On 2 and 4, you've got these smaller bearings here, and then on 1 and 3, you've got slightly larger ones. So I've got all these bearings set in here right now. Let me go ahead, torque this thing back together, and then we can run through here and start validating our measurements. We're looking for about 1.5 to 2 thou on these mains, so we'll see what we end up coming back with. If I need to order different bearings, we'll order different bearings for all of these. But you got to start somewhere with your measurements, so standard bearings are not a bad place to start. So we're gonna do exactly what we did with our rods here again. So with our bore gauge, we're gonna go ahead and get our micrometer set up. So we're looking for 2.362. So 2.3263. No, 3.2. Jesus, 2.63, 2.362. I can't even talk anymore, you guys. Most dial indicators will have a small arrow, and that should be right on the money. And we are zeroed out, my friends. So now we can start checking our main bearing clearances. So like I said, I'm gonna have to adjust this off of each main because every main is a little bit different. So we're looking for about 1.5 to 2 thou on each of these. It doesn't it's not a bad idea to toss some towels down underneath the case halves just to make it a little bit more level and a little bit more sturdy, because the Subaru engine, it's not perfectly flat when it's sat up on its butt like this. So let's see what we got for bearing number one. About 1.5. As long as we're between 1.5 and 2 thou on this, we're golden. I don't expect this to take anything else other than standard bearings. This engine didn't have that many miles on it when I tore it apart, so we may be pretty good here. 5. You don't want to go too tight and you don't want to go too loose. If you have too loose of clearance, you're gonna have really bad oil pressure. If you have too tight, you're gonna spin a bearing. So you gotta be really careful with how you go about doing this and making sure that all of your measurements are spot on. So let's keep going down the line here. All right, main number 2, we got the exact same measurement as before, so we're gonna have to fish this guy down in there. Right there we have about 1.5 thou. Let's check in one more spot. Once again, 1.5 to 2 thou. So far so good. Main number 3, I do need to adjust this down here to main number 3. With some of these mains, you may get sucked into the groove into the middle of it. You don't want to measure inside of the groove there. And you can stick your hand down through the oil pan just to make sure that everything is nice and level. So we're at about 2 thou on number 3. This is the smoothest engine build I've done so far. Normally, then again, this is the newest set of case halves I've also ever used, so there's that. Normally the case halves I use are pretty old. Like I'm talking like 05 STI old, and they've spun a bearing. This one didn't spin a bearing on the mains. It spun a bearing on the rods, I should say, just to clarify on that one. Doesn't matter now, everything's machined and coming back beautiful. 2 thou on the money right there. About 2 thou. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with what we're looking at for main bearings on here, you guys. Everything's coming in at about 2 thou. 1.5 to 2 thou is typically where I want to be on this, so that way oil pressure isn't crazy. Now that we have our main bearing clearances all solid, we have our rod bearing clearances solid, we've measured our crank and verified all of our clearances. Next up is piston ring clearance, which this one's going to heavily vary. So you might be thinking, yeah, we're finally done with all the measurements. We can go ahead and put this thing together. Wrong, unfortunately. So next up, we gotta do the piston rings. So we're using CP pistons for this. Now on all of these pistons, you are gonna see it labeled front with an arrow. I've already gone ahead and labeled which piston is gonna go in what cylinder. So we're gonna start out doing cylinder number 2, because on a Subaru, it's 1, 2, back one back there is 3, this one right here is 4. So we're gonna start out with number 2, which is that guy right there. Now we're not just gonna be slapping pistons in here, because we gotta put the crank and the rods together and then the block together and all that before we can even get pistons in. But we're gonna get all the measurements done with today, so that way tomorrow we can just assemble it all. So you've got 3 different rings here. The silver one's gonna be your compression ring. The blackish, grayish one is gonna be your oil scraper ring. You can definitely feel it's the oil scraper ring. If you run your finger along the edge of it right there, you'll feel that it is actually pretty sharp, and that's going to scrape the cylinder walls to get any excess oil off and push it down towards the oil pan and the crankcase down here. And then the last ring on here is going to be your oil control ring. So normally you don't need to really mess with this ring for sizing or anything like that. Those really just go right on. These are the 2 we're going to focus on right now. So we need to get the ring gap set. Now ring gap is going to highly change upon what your application is. For what power level this engine's being built for, we're going to be setting the ring gap to 0.014 for the top and 0.017 for the bottom ring. If you're confused on what your ring gap should be or what you want to set your ring gap, there's some formulas you can follow. There are tuners you can talk to. There's engine builders you can talk to. Some of them may or may not help you out. It's really hit or miss with a lot of the people that you're going to find. But these are this is what I'm doing. So 14 thou on the top ring, 17 thou on the bottom ring. Boost and fuel is also going to play a factor in what you set your rings to. So this is what we're going with here. So what we're gonna be doing here is, this is a piston ring grinder. Now we're not just gonna jump straight to this and start grinding our pistons down. The first thing we need to do is get these into the cylinders, so that way we can currently measure what they're at so far. So you are going to need a set of feeler gauges. I totally spaced on this at the beginning of the video, but you are going to need these, as well as a piston ring separator tool guy. I would not suggest that when you go to put these rings on your pistons, you like stretch them, you try to like twist them to get them to sit in their homes, because there are little grooves in the piston for all of those to sit, and you don't want to be like twisting these guys or anything like that. Get the proper tools, make your life easier. Let's get one of these guys up into our cylinder here. We'll measure the current gap and we'll start subtracting with that. Remember, you can take away material, can't add material back. You're gonna have to buy new rings if you do that. Now before we just start going and throwing some rings in here and whatnot, we're gonna wanna throw a little bit, I'm using assembly lube, you can also use oil if you want. Just lube up the inside of the cylinder wall, but just for the safety of the cylinder walls, don't destroy it if you can avoid it. Just toss on a little bit of assembly lube. I personally use this red line stuff, it's good assembly lube, never had an issue with it. It spreads nicely, you get a decent amount, it goes quite a distance also. So now with these piston rings here, you're gonna have 2 of them like we talked about. There is going to be a little marking on it. I don't know, you guys are not gonna be able to see that. I'll show you guys after I grind it. There's either gonna be a dot or some type of numerical symbol on the piston rings themselves, and those are gonna face up. So you wanna make sure those aren't facing down or anything like that. These are directional. So let me show you how to get these in here. You're just gonna start by pinching the ring together a little bit, pushing it into the cylinder, and then rotating. You little dirty hooer. Pinch it, and then push it in and lay it down. Now you don't want to be just yeeting on that thing, pushing it down. Take one of your pistons and just get it in here and get everything nice and level. Just get a nice flat little surface right there, so that way you can accurately measure your gap. So let me show you guys kind of what we're sitting at for gap right now. So our current gap is about 3/1000ths of an inch. You can see right there where the ends of the pistons rings meet. Plus having a little bit of assembly lube in there lets you see your gap as you go down. So we need to open that up a decent ways. A 5000 shim only fit through the beginning half of it. When you do go to grind these down, you do want to make sure that you're doing it evenly, so that way you're not getting a beveled edge on one side of the ring. So let's get this guy out and let's start grinding it down a little bit. This thing's cheap too, I'll link that down below. I think that thing was like 20 bucks. Huge lifesaver. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab this ring, pop it out of there. I'm gonna wipe it down real quick, just so no dust or anything sticks to it as we grind this guy. So you wanna make sure that the piston ring itself is flat up against that. You can use these guides if you want to when you go to do them. It's not a bad thing to do. So we're just gonna pull off a little bit here at a time. So let me show you here. Right here we've got a 0.014 shim. That's what we're gonna be using to check. Up in here we have our gap right there. If I bring our shim right here, you guys can see that it goes in literally perfectly right there. So now that we've got our top ring done, I'm gonna repeat this process for the rest of the pistons. The bottom ring's gonna be, or the oil scraper ring's gonna be the exact same way. Let me get at least this oil scraper ring done real quick, and then I'll show you guys. Actually, you know, I'm gonna run through all of them. On the last piston, I'll show you guys how to put all the rings on the piston. So let me run through all these and knock out the rest of these measurements on this block, so that way we can get to putting the rings on the pistons. Now for me, I like to prep all my stuff before building. So that includes getting the rings onto the piston. So we have all of our measurements set on everything for the rings, which is the last measurement that we need to take for all of this, for the short block build at least. Our main bearings are good, our rod bearings are good, all of that is good. So to get the piston rings on, the first thing that I start with is this oil control ring guy. It's got a whole bunch of like detents on it going all the way around the ring. You literally just slide that one on. It's gonna go into the bottom-most slot on the piston right there, the one closest to the crankshaft. Next up, for the 2 rings that hold in the oil compression ring, you've got one of them that has, there's no way I'm gonna be able to show you guys on camera. There's 4 of each of these. One of them has a small little tab on the end of it. The other one does not. So the one with the small little tab is gonna go underneath of this oil ring in one of the little grooves. After I get all these rings on, I'll bring the camera up and I'll show you guys, but it's gonna sit in one of the little grooves. So let me get this guy. I hate these rings. Out of all the rings, this is the one I hate the most. Home, and that's gonna go underneath of the detented ring and slide into its home. I hate these rings. I'm not gonna even get this ring permanently set in its home until tomorrow when I go to install all of this. I just wanna get it all like somewhat assembled. Next, the other portion of that oil control ring is gonna go on top of the detented ring. So you're gonna have one on top and one on bottom. All right, so we have our oil control ring in. Like I said, I'm not even gonna try to compress this one down until tomorrow. when I go to install this. You're also going to want to make sure, I'll cover this in the install, you're going to want to make sure all of your rings are facing different directions for the gaps. You don't want all the gaps in one spot. It is possible that they can let compression through, which is not something that you want, especially on a first start with a brand new engine. Next up, oil scraper ring. So that number or that dot that we talked about earlier, that's going to face up toward the crown of the piston here. So this is where these pliers are going to come in handy. You're going to slide one end of the ring into each little groove of the pliers, and you're just going to ever so gently open it up and then get it onto its home. You don't want to always cooperate, which is, you know what, totally fine. So come on, baby, there we go. Let go of you and then get you up into your home. See, and then sometimes, bam, there we go. Oil scraper ring is now in its home, so that way when the piston ring compressor goes on that, it'll compress all the rings down. And then last up, the compression ring. Once again, that N25, it is what is on our CP pistons, is going to go ahead and face up toward the crown of the piston. You can use your pliers and just slide it into its home here. It's a little easier to get the back of it in first and then work your way around to the front. Once it's in, it's not going to come out. So now we have all of our rings on our pistons. All of our measurements are complete, and this is actually a prime example of what not to do right here. So you remember when I said to make sure all of your ring gaps are offset? You see how right there these two are not? So you can literally just grab one of the rings, rotate it around, and then on the instructions they're going to tell you where to offset all of your ring gaps to. Like, they give you like a nice little diagram right there. I'm not going to do that till when I go to assemble all of this, but that covers all the measurements. I know that building engines can be scary, especially if you've never done it before. The scariest part about building an engine is the measurements, I promise. Assembly is the easy part. The hard part is just making sure all your measurements are solid. So that is all I've got for you guys on this one. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to assemble an EJ25. It's not going to be same for every engine out there. My 4G63, when we go to assemble that one here in a couple weeks, is going to be a lot closer to a lot of other engines out there. But I hope this video helped you guys in going over the measurements, how to get the measurements. Like I said, I'll link all these tools down below in the description. I'll link some videos on some good videos to show you how to read a set of micrometers. It's really not as scary as it looks. The scariest part about building an engine is just making sure all your measurements are spot on. If all your measurements are spot on, you don't really have anything to stress about, as long as you're assembling everything in the proper order according to the torque specs. Like I said, print all of that documentation out before you go to do anything. It is incredibly helpful to have that handy, so that way you know what you're trying to target when you go to build your engine. And like I said, every engine's specs are going to be a little bit different for what your rod bearing clearances are, what your main bearing clearances are, what your ring gaps are. Literally all of these things are going to vary from engine to engine to engine. This is just what I'm building this one to and having it set up to. So if this video helped you guys, you know what to do. Go ahead, hit that like button, turn it black, blue, green, yellow, purple, silver, cyan, whatever color it turns for you. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to be, one of these corners, no idea which one I'll put it in quite yet. We'll do another one of these videos for the 4G63 when we go to put that engine together and do all the measurements for that one. So with that, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, homies.